Alderwood was the kind of town that rarely made the news. It was a place people drove through on their way somewhere else. A cluster of neatly aligned houses with quiet streets and families who prided themselves on knowing each other by name. Summers were filled with block parties and barbecues, winters with snow shoveling done in shifts as neighbors lent a helping hand. On the surface, it was the picture of safety and simplicity. Yet it was often in places like this, where nothing bad was expected to happen, that the darkest stories took root. Wexford Lane sat at the edge of town, a curved street where children played kickball until dusk and porch lights came on like clockwork. Most of the homes looked nearly identical. Built during a housing boom in the 1980s, their vinyl siding faded from years of sun. There was one house, however, that stood apart, not because of its design, but because of its silence. While laughter echoed from other yards, that house remained still, curtains always drawn, blinds tilted in such a way that no one could see inside. The lawn grew wild compared to the neatly cut grass around it, and weeds clawed their way up the cracked driveway. It was the only place on the street that seemed frozen in time. Neighbors often speculated about who lived there. Some swore they saw a man slip in and out at odd hours, tall and thin, his face always partially hidden beneath a cap. Others claimed the house had been empty for months. What everyone agreed on was that it didn't feel like the rest of Wexford Lane. Children were warned not to ride their bikes too close, and even the mail carrier left letters in a hurry, as if lingering too long on the porch carried some unseen risk. At first, the strange behavior was little more than background noise in the rhythm of daily life. People had their own worries, their own schedules, and nobody wanted to be the one to pry too much. But as the weeks turned to months, something began to change. It started subtly with odd sounds reported at night, dull thuds like furniture being dragged across the floor or the muffled hum of machinery when the town around it was otherwise silent. A few neighbors dismissed it as the sounds of an old house settling, but others found it impossible to ignore. Then came the smell. On a warm summer evening, a sour odor drifted down the street, faint at first, then stronger as the days passed. It clung to the air, carried by the breeze, impossible to escape. Families shut their windows tight, blaming the woods behind the neighborhood or perhaps a dead animal caught in the heat. But no animal could have produced a stench so thick, so relentless. Each day, it seemed to grow worse, saturating the air until even the flowers planted in front yards seemed tainted by it. The question hung unspoken in everyone's mind. What was happening inside that house? Eventually, complaints made their way to the authorities. At first, officers treated it as a routine call, expecting perhaps an abandoned property or a minor health hazard. None of them could have predicted that stepping across that threshold would unravel one of the most disturbing cases the town, or the country, had ever seen. The officers who arrived at the house on Wexford Lane were prepared for something unpleasant, but nothing could have braced them for what they would encounter inside. The moment the front door creaked open, the air shifted. A wave of suffocating stench rolled out, hitting them so hard that one officer instinctively pulled his shirt over his nose. It was not the smell of rotting food or mold, but something far heavier, something unmistakably tied to decay. The quiet of the neighborhood made it worse. The sounds of sprinklers clicking in nearby yards and children laughing down the block clashed against the reality that the officers had just stepped into. The living room looked as if it had been abandoned years ago. Dust blanketed every surface, coating the furniture in a dull gray film. Newspapers were scattered across the floor, yellowed with age, their dates stretching back several years. The wallpaper peeled in strips, and the carpet beneath their boots gave off the soft crunch of something long left damp. It looked less like a home and more like a shell that had been emptied of ordinary life. Yet the air was not just thick with odor. It carried a strange weight, as though the walls themselves remembered something unspeakable. Room by room, the officers advanced with growing unease. The kitchen was worse, its sink filled with rusted utensils, its fridge unplugged and empty save for a lingering sourness that clung to the air. There were no signs of recent meals, no dishes, no groceries, nothing to suggest anyone had lived there comfortably. It was the kind of stillness that didn't feel accidental. Whoever had stayed there had not been living, only existing. When they reached the basement door, the odor intensified. The officers exchanged a glance, their instincts screaming that this was where the truth lay. The wooden steps creaked under their weight as they descended into the shadows. At the bottom, a bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, its pull cord swaying slightly as if it had been disturbed not long before. With a sharp tug, the room was illuminated, and what the light revealed left them frozen in place. Against the far wall stood a neat row of large plastic containers, each one sealed tightly with heavy lids. The containers were not dusty like the rest of the house. They looked used, handled, cared for the sorely. Some were marked with strips of tape, handwritten numbers scrawled across them in dark ink. The smell was strongest here, seeping from the containers, unmistakably human in its origin. The silence of the basement pressed down on them as they approached, every instinct warning them to turn away, but duty pushed them forward. The first lid was pried open, and the reality came spilling out. Inside lay human remains, carefully packed as though the killer had treated them as artifacts to be preserved. The pieces were dismembered, wrapped, and arranged with unsettling precision. The next container revealed the same, and the next, until it became clear that this was not an isolated crime but the work of someone who had been at it for years. Each discovery piled onto the horror, confirming the suspicions that no one had dared to voice. The officers stood in stunned silence, the light bulb flickering above them as though struggling to stay alive. They had uncovered something that would change everything about the quiet town of Alderwood. What had begun as a complaint about a foul smell had opened the door to a nightmare that would soon draw the eyes of the entire nation. Detectives pored over the basement for hours, cataloging everything in painstaking detail. The containers were photographed, sealed, and transported with care, but what left investigators unsettled was not only the gruesome nature of what they found. It was the deliberate organization. Each container bore markings in black ink, with dates spanning across several years. The entries seemed to follow no obvious pattern, yet the consistency suggested ritual. It wasn't chaos or impulse, it was routine. As evidence teams combed the rest of the house, they uncovered a series of notebooks tucked into drawers, wedged between floorboards, even inside hollowed-out books on the shelves. The handwriting was immaculate, small, and controlled, each line written with the cold precision of someone recording data rather than confessing thoughts. At first glance, the entries looked like schedules, lists of times, locations, and seemingly mundane notes. But as detectives pieced them together, the meaning grew clearer. These were accounts of how the victims had been chosen, observed, and ultimately claimed. What shocked investigators was the randomness. Victims were not close acquaintances or even casual friends. They were strangers who had, by chance, brushed against the killer's life for a moment. A delivery driver dropping off a package, a salesman knocking on the wrong door, a neighbor walking a dog past the property at the wrong time. Each journal described how the killer had followed them, studied them, and decided when it was time. It was as if every ordinary encounter was seen as a potential entry into the collection. The journals revealed an obsession with control. Each victim was reduced to details: height, weight, clothing worn during the first encounter, habits observed in the days after. There was no humanity in the descriptions, only statistics and cold analysis. Beside each entry were notes about how long the victim had survived once taken, followed by clinical descriptions of how they had been dismembered. The tone was detached, almost scientific, as if the writer viewed people as experiments rather than lives. Detectives also found a series of photographs hidden inside a locked metal box beneath the bed. The images were low quality, grainy, as if taken with an old phone camera. They showed the victims in ordinary settings, smiling at a supermarket, filling a car with gas, walking into their homes. None of them appeared frightened or aware. These were trophies, captured at a time when the victims had no idea they were being hunted. The realization chilled even seasoned officers. The killer had been watching people long before making a move, building anticipation like an artist preparing a canvas. The further investigators dug, the more disturbing the picture became. This was not a series of impulsive crimes, but a carefully constructed process. The journals, photographs, and containers worked together like chapters of a twisted story. Each piece revealed a mind that thrived on order and secrecy. The killer was not sloppy or reckless, but meticulous and patient. That patience was what frightened authorities most. By the end of the search, detectives understood they were not dealing with a random burst of violence. They were staring into the work of someone who had dedicated years to their craft, someone who found satisfaction not in chaos but in absolute control. The evidence did not just reveal what had been done. It revealed a pattern, one that suggested the killer had no reason to stop, and perhaps had already moved on to their next victim. The question of who had lived in the house quickly became the central mystery. Detectives assumed that uncovering the identity of the resident would lead them closer to understanding the killings, but the search turned into a frustrating maze of dead ends. Property records showed the home had once belonged to a couple who moved away years earlier. After that, the trail went cold. There were no updated deeds, no tax records filed, and no clear indication of who had taken possession. It was as if the house had simply slipped through the cracks of the system, left floating in a limbo where its true occupant could remain invisible. Neighbors gave fragmented descriptions of a man they occasionally saw. Some said he was tall and thin, others described him as average, with unremarkable features that slipped from memory as soon as he was gone. A few mentioned the dark jacket he always wore, regardless of the weather, and how he seemed to vanish quickly when spotted. What united their accounts was the sense that he avoided interaction, offering no greetings, never joining community events, and refusing eye contact. He was a shadow that slipped in and out, leaving no trace beyond the uneasy feeling of having been near him. Inside the house, investigators found personal effects, but nothing that could be tied to a name. Clothing bore no labels, documents were shredded beyond recognition, and any electronic devices had been wiped clean. Even fingerprints collected from surfaces inside the home produced no matches in any database. The man had managed to exist without leaving behind the usual threads of identity. No driver's license, no medical records, no employment history. It was as though he had deliberately erased himself from the world, carving out a life in the gaps where no one thought to look. The most unsettling discovery was the missing container. In the basement, the row of plastic tubs had been arranged neatly, their alignment too careful to be accidental. Yet the space where one more container should have been was glaringly empty. Dust outlines showed that something had rested there for a long time before being removed. This absence unsettled investigators more than the remains that had been left behind. It suggested intention, a final act carried out before abandoning the home. The missing container was not an oversight. It was a message. Detectives began to suspect that the man had left long before the house was entered, perhaps even anticipating that the smell would eventually draw attention. His disappearance was too clean, too precise to be coincidence. The journals ended abruptly, the final entry written months earlier, leaving no clue as to where he had gone. Witnesses who thought they had seen him more recently could not be certain. Memory played tricks when recalling someone who worked so hard to remain unremarkable. Luck. The case grew colder with every passing day. Tips poured in from across the state, each claiming a sighting of a man in a dark jacket, but none could be confirmed. The absence of identity turned him into something larger than a suspect. He became a specter in the minds of the community, an unknown figure who had walked among them unnoticed while carrying out horrors beneath their feet. And with the missing container unaccounted for, there lingered the chilling possibility that his work had not ended on Wexford Lane, but had simply shifted to another place, waiting to be discovered all over again. The investigation stretched far beyond Alderwood as detectives chased every possible lead. Cold case files from neighboring counties were reopened, unsolved disappearances cross-referenced with the dates found in the journals. The connections were haunting. Names that had long since faded from public memory aligned almost perfectly with the timeline. Missing persons whose cases were assumed to be runaways or accidents now appeared to be victims of something far darker. The realization spread quickly among investigators. The house on Wexford Lane was not the beginning, but only one chapter in a much larger story. Evidence from the journals suggested the killer had been operating for over a decade, possibly longer. Towns hundreds of miles apart shared similar mysteries. Delivery workers who never completed their routes, travelers who vanished between gas stations, families who searched for loved ones with no answers. Each case, once considered isolated, fit neatly into the meticulous system outlined in the writings. The scope was overwhelming. What had been uncovered in Alderwood was only a fragment of a much wider trail, Officials debated whether to release the details publicly. Some argued that the community deserved to know the full extent of the crimes, while others worried that too much exposure would spark mass panic. The decision was made to limit what was shared. Families of confirmed victims were contacted privately, given only pieces of the truth. The official story was framed as the discovery of a serial offender whose identity remained unknown. The missing container was never mentioned outside law enforcement circles. The idea that evidence had been deliberately taken and carried away was too terrifying for the public to absorb. It was demolished quietly, the debris hauled away under heavy supervision. Still, the land felt poisoned, voided by children and adults alike. The lot was left empty, grass struggling to grow where the basement once sat. Some residents moved away, unable to sleep knowing what had been unearthed just down the street. Those who stayed never looked at their town the same way again. Detectives continued their search for the man, but each lead dissolved into nothing. Grainy security footage of a figure in a dark jacket entering a bus station, a report of someone fitting his vague description wandering through another small town, a stranger spotted in a roadside diner who paid cash and left without speaking. Uncertainty, no evidence, no answers. It was as though he had mastered the art of vanishing, slipping through cracks in plain sight. Authorities could not decide if it contained the remains of a final victim or if it was something else entirely, perhaps a piece of evidence the man wanted to preserve, perhaps a token of control he refused to abandon. Whatever the truth, it ensured that closure remained impossible. In the years that followed, the case became legend, spoken of in hushed tones, an example of evil so calculated and cold that even seasoned investigators found it hard to discuss. Streaming platforms and television producers approached with offers to dramatize the events, but every attempt was blocked, deemed too grotesque, too unsettling for mainstream audiences. The story remained locked in police files and whispered among true crime enthusiasts as one of the darkest tales never fully told. Somewhere beyond Alderwood, he was likely still walking among strangers, unnoticed, unremarkable, carrying with him the knowledge of what he had done and perhaps preparing to do it again. The case, like the missing container, remained open, a haunting reminder that some nightmares do not end, they only move on to the next quiet street.